In this video, we'll discuss the effect of study design on our statistical story. So, we're going to focus in this lecture on three main concepts: sample size, sampling, and structure, by which I mean experiment versus observation, and there's going to be some more involved with that. Other terms you'll hear related to these same concepts are power as it relates to sample size, external validity as it relates to sampling, and internal validity as it relates to the structure, respectively. Actually, I'm probably going to use these terms, power, internal validity, external validity, instead of the three concepts, sample size, sampling, and structure, which we've talked about in previous lecture sets, because they're a little bit more general, and we can discuss how each of those concepts play into those larger themes. While all of these concepts are connected, each of them has a very different impact on the story that we can tell from our finding. So it's funny, our study design actually has very deep impacts on our statistical storytelling, and it's something that we don't talk about. Now, we've talked about some of these things for sure, but we haven't really talked about how does that then impact the story that we can tell with findings from that type of study. So that's what we're going to get into a little bit today, discussing each of these in turn. So, statistical power is a broad concept. It is the concept of finding a statistically significant difference when there's a difference in the population. So, let's consider doing a antibiotic prescription protocol, and we're looking at differences between individuals trained in the new protocol and individuals not trained in the protocol. So what I'm trying to determine in this particular case is the proportion of broad versus narrow spectrum antibiotics assigned within each case. And in this, we'll just call it number of narrow spectrum antibiotics, with the goal of assigning more narrow spectrum antibiotics when medically appropriate. So power is the concept that there actually is a difference between the groups. That's the starting point of power. It starts with a different place than our null hypothesis and hypothesis testing. Power starts by saying there is a difference in the underlying population. And it asks, what's the percent chance you, quote unquote, find it? What's the percent chance that you find the difference that's actually there? And by finding the difference in a sample, that's a declaration of statistical significance. That's us finding the difference. So power asks, what's the chance that we find a difference, assuming that it's actually there? Now, with everything else being equal, power increases as sample size increases. Now, power, our type 1 error rate alpha, and the effect size are all very closely related. And as one of them moves with the others being fixed, we can tell what will happen with another one. So for instance, if the sample size in alpha is fixed, as effect size increase, power also increases. But here, sample size increases help our statistical power. And what tends to happen in the way that we look at problems is that our type 1 error rate is typically fixed at 0.05 in practical applied research. The effect size is what it is. But the sample size increasing is the one thing that we can typically control. We can usually control at least some level, more than the size of the effect, how many participants we get in our study. And so this bullet point is just saying that by getting more participants, what we do is increase the chance that we find a statistically significant difference if there actually is a difference to be found. And that's the contribution of sample size. What's interesting is that low sample sizes are associated with studies that are unlikely to find this effect, even if it's there. And even beyond that, studies with low sample sizes are vulnerable to seeing effects that may move in the opposite direction of population effects. Now, I want to be careful. This is not the treatment was actually harming the patients. This is the treatment at the population level is actually a helpful treatment, but in your sample, it looks harmful. Not necessarily statistically significant, but even without it being statistically significant, it will look pretty bad. How likely is that to happen? Well, it kind of depends on the actual sample size and the size of the effect. The lower the sample size is and lower the effect size is, the more likely it is for something like this to happen. It's a bit of a risk, actually, now that I think about it, with the concept of run small studies first, because while it's a good thought, you got to make sure you don't go too small. Otherwise, you risk this. And again, risking this isn't necessarily the end of the world, but consider in a very practical way, if you ran a small study with 10 participants just to get data, and then you found that the program had a negative effect, though it wasn't statistically significant. Imagine trying to go to your boss with those preliminary numbers and trying to argue that it could still be the program could still be effective. I guess with a confidence interval, you would have a reasonable range to show that reasonably the program could be effective. But still going and saying, yeah, well, in our sample, this was harmful to participants, but maybe it won't be in the population, or maybe if we got a bigger sample size, that could be harmful. All I'm trying to say here is, while we do run initial studies with lower sample sizes sometimes, you don't want to go too low. Otherwise, you risk, again, the direction of the sample not matching the direction of the population. And again, what I'm saying is your program was really positively effective. It really worked well. It's a good program. You should keep it. But in the sample, just from random chance, it looked like it went in the opposite direction. And that could be really difficult to explain. Now, that doesn't really happen with larger sample sizes as long as the size of the effect is moderate. But with low sample sizes, that becomes more of a risk. All right. External validity. External validity and internal validity go together, and they kind of, well, I shouldn't say that. External validity looks at, they do go together, but the questions are a little bit different than one another. External validity asks, where do the results apply? So typically we ask external validity questions when we're trying to take our results and apply them elsewhere. That's an external validity issue. One way that we can support external validity of a study is randomly sampling from the population. So if I take my sample for my study randomly from the population, and let's say in one particular case, I randomly select from a population of an entire state or an entire country, and then I show a particular method to be effective. Well, that's really good evidence that if somebody else in that population, in that state, or in that country used my method, they could also potentially see it to be effective. Let's phrase this in a bad way. Let's say I randomly selected my participants from patients in a very, very specific population that's not very representative elsewhere. So maybe I used my hospital, and maybe my hospital is a very fringe case that we see very different types of patient loads than most other hospitals. And in that case, I ran my study, I got my evidence, and my program was effective. Well, having run that study with that particular sample that doesn't really represent anybody else, it's going to be very difficult to use my results as evidence to then support the use of the program elsewhere. Versus, again, if I had a nationally representative sample where it would be a lot easier to have confidence or a lot more evidence to say, yes, my results match outside of just my sample, or individuals in other areas of the country could use this and feel good about using this program. So randomly sampling is actually a really key point to helping our results to apply to a broader context. Now, why is this important? Again, think always back to the storytelling component of this. Think about what we're talking about. So here with external validity, I'm talking about who can I reasonably speak to when I'm telling my story? Who can I say the results apply to? In many, many situations, people want their results to apply to everybody. But very rarely do I have a sample that actually represents everybody. So I have to think about who do my results apply to, this external validity question. And that's a big part of the conclusions of my story, thinking through what does my study design in terms of the sample support regarding the applicability of these results. So typically, your results absolutely apply to your sample. If you use inferential statistics, you can extend that to results applying to the population represented by your sample. But now you have to think through who is the population represented by your sample. And if my sample is representative of 20 to 30-year-old healthy adults who were outside the supermarket at the time that I decided to do recruiting, well, that's not a particularly interesting population, and I need to be really careful that my conclusions don't go beyond that and don't start talking about practice in the country or implications for that, because that's not supported by my study. On the other hand, if I'm really careful about how I've selected my sample and I get individuals who are representative of a broader population, say in my hospital system, or maybe I'm select to a particular hospital that is very representative of other hospitals in the area to implement this study in, now my conclusions, and as I write up the results of my study and who they apply to, that population that my inferential statistics help me make decisions about, that population is a much more broadly applicable population. It's a much more interesting population. Again, it doesn't really matter which population it is. All that this is saying is you have to be careful about that when you're making this claim. And that's as it relates to random sampling. Now, external validity, as I said, is a broader issue than just random sampling, and it has to do with other study design issues as well. So, for instance, participants may behave differently because they know they're being studied. We also might have conditions of the study that would be different than when they're applied in the field. This seems like a small thing, but actually it's a massive consideration in terms of external validity. Think about that if we're implementing a study, especially if we have some money behind the study or grant funding, we might provide staff with detailed training. We might do fidelity checks. We might have a large amount of technical support available. We might have a large amount of administrative support and extra financial incentives for staff individuals. All of this would not be available if the program were implemented in the field. And all of these are conditions of the study that would be, again, different and would limit this external validity. If I took the results from my study of a very highly trained and highly paid staff and then tried to use that to make conclusions about what this would look like with an unwell-trained and an unpaid staff, those conclusions very well might be different. So within this, again, we have to determine the context of our study and write our results and the story from our results within that context. That's the concept of external validity. External validity is really thinking about who this applies to, who does this extend to. And at a very specific level, it's relating to what's the population represented by the sample, but it's also relating to the conditions of the study. What are the study conditions in terms of the staff time? What are the study conditions in terms of the participants? Are participants on their best behavior because they know they're being studied? All of these are things to consider with regards to external validity, and all impact the story we tell. Just like with a good sample, we can extend our study results more. As our conditions of our study match more and more what they would be expected to be if this were implemented in the field, we can be more and more confident in our recommendations regarding the implication of the results as it relates to a broader population. Sometimes this concept is called field validity, where the conditions of the study match very well what they would be if they were applied in the field. Internal validity. So the concept of internal validity refers to the question, are the results telling us what they think were telling us? Big picture is that there's always other explanations. One of the earliest examples of a lack of internal validity that we saw in this class was with our ice cream and shark attacks. We said there's a large relationship between ice cream and shark attacks. And we kind of pointed out like that doesn't necessarily mean that ice cream causes shark attacks or shark attacks cause ice cream. So that is an internal validity issue. The question of, are the results telling me what I think they're telling me? I think the relationship between ice cream and shark attacks is telling me that ice cream causes shark attacks, that sharks really love ice cream. And so when I eat ice cream and I go in the water, sharks just want to gnaw the ice cream out of my stomach. Like that is that really what those results are telling, or could there be another explanation? That is an issue of internal validity. Of course, the true explanation that we came up with was that summer, or seasons more generally, are the source of this relationship between ice cream sales and shark attacks. And ultimately, the answer to this question regarding my interpretation would be no. The results are not telling me what I think it's telling me. The reason I do this silly example is to highlight what this means, because often we think, hey, it's a statistical result. Like, what do you mean? Is it telling me what I think it's telling me? And ultimately, it goes down to your interpretation of what the results say. The numbers are the numbers. The number of ice cream sales is the number of ice cream sales. The number of shark attacks is the number of shark attacks. Their relationship is their relationship. Like, statistics aren't lying about that. It's my interpretation on what causes what and why that is. That's where I get into trouble, and that's where I can get into trouble with internal validity. That's where I can get in trouble with some of my data analysis techniques too. One of the largest causes of lack of internal validity is that our groups are not the same to start with. So let me do this. We were talking about this antibiotic protocol earlier. So let's say that one of my groups to start with is a group of individuals who's already been heavily trained on this antibiotic stuff, and another group is not. And then it turns out that my group who's already been heavily trained does better. Should my program take credit for that? Or could the credit for that be attributed to the fact that that group was just already trained to start with? That's a great question, and that's an open question. There's no answer to that. I don't know how to distinguish between those things. And in fact, once we have an error in the internal validity as a study design issue, there's not necessarily, and frankly, there's often not a statistical way to differentiate between that if the study has been designed and doesn't account for those confounding variables. So in this case, if I didn't ever ask that ahead of time and somebody pointed this out after the fact, I'd have to shrug my shoulders and say, yeah, maybe that is the real reason instead of my program. And that really pulls the rug out from under your feet in terms of the evidence of your story, the support of your story. Because now there's another reasonable explanation that you can't speak to as to whether or not that explanation is the real cause. Now, again, this is this other reasonable explanation is differences between the groups to start with. So how can we account for that? Well, the biggest way we can do that is by randomly assigning participants to treatment group or control group. By randomly assigning participants, if we had that case, say, where I had one group that had all the experience and the other group that had no experience, if instead I said, okay, participant A, I'm going to randomly assign you. Participant B, I'm going to randomly assign you. Then both groups are going to have a mix of individuals with experience and without experience. So that if someone says, well, could the groups be different to start with? I can say, no, because of random assignment, they are balanced on average, at least to start with. So random assignment is actually a fantastic tool to alleviate some of those alternate explanations. And the big alternate explanation it alleviates is the explanation that perhaps the groups are somehow different than one another. So the group that got the treatment wasn't better because of the treatment. It was better just because it was a better group to start with. And random assignment alleviates that. Now, as before, while random assignment is a big component in establishing internal validity, it's certainly not the only component. And any other study design issues that could cause alternate explanations for the relationship between variables or the alternate explanations for group differences, those are all issues with internal validity. So consider if we have a study looking at blood pressure with a drug trying to lower it and we're using a placebo. For logistical reasons, let's say we have the drug group come in the morning to get their blood pressure taken and the placebo group come in the afternoon. Final results, the drug group had lower blood pressure. And then when I'm presenting these results, somebody pointed out, hey, you had the drug group come in the morning. Could the low blood pressure results just be due to them coming in the morning? As with the earlier example, the answer is, well, yeah, I guess it could. And there's no defense against this. Now, I could point out, studies that say, oh, the blood pressure on average, these might be the expected blood pressure differences between morning and afternoon, and the change in groups is different. But ultimately, I'm trying to, in the end, explain away a potential explanation. And were I to simply have designed my study a little better, I could, through the study design, have explained this away. Let's randomly assign when people are going to come in. Half of each group will be in the morning. Half of each group will be in the afternoon. Then that's not even a question or a possible explanation of these results. The thing with those post hoc explanations is unless I have that data, or in this case, even if I did have that data, because of the study design with the post hoc explanation, that is never a sufficient explanation. That to say, I could argue why I don't think blood pressure changes between morning and afternoon. On the other hand, could that have been the case in this instance? Yeah, it could have. And I really don't have an argument against that. That is an alternate potential explanation. And while that is a viable alternate explanation, there is no counter argument. So it's very important to consider these issues ahead of time, again, because there's nothing we can do after the fact. There's a famous saying that says something to the order of, you should always consult a statistician at the early stages of your study, because if you come to him after data have collected, he simply serves as a mortician. He could perhaps say what the study died of. And the major point here is that in such cases, again, we can't do statistical magic always to fix things that are flawed in the design stage. It's important to consider this. And ultimately, again, this relates to the story we can tell, the evidence of our story. We're trying to tell a story that the drug is the explanation for the change. We're trying to tell the story that my program is the explanation for the change in the assignment of narrow spectrum antibiotics. But ultimately, if I leave myself open by putting everybody in the program group who's already very experienced with narrow spectrum antibiotics, putting everybody in the control group who doesn't have any experience at all with any antibiotic assignment in general, then that difference between the groups could be the explanation, not my program. And there's no counter argument. Yes, that could. And while that remains an alternate explanation, your statistical story is undercut by that. Now, I do mention this. In healthcare, we often hear the terms blinded studies or double-blinded studies. I wanted to drop this on this slide because this is what those terms and what those concepts are meant to speak to. In internal validity, we use blinded and double-blinded studies to help with this. Blinded studies prevent researcher bias. You might hear of the John Henry effect, people who are in the control group but work really, really, really hard, or people who are in the treatment group and feel way better about themselves. That is what blinded studies are intended to do. Double-blinded studies add the additional aid of reducing researcher bias. There's a couple examples, but I kind of like when the researcher handed out the placebo pill, they frowned, and when they handed out the drug pill, they gave a big wink. So that's what double-blinded studies are intended to prevent. I don't know that ever actually happened, but that's a story we tell. In any case, this has been a pretty quick video on, or certainly relative to the rest of the videos in this set, has been a video on how study design impacts our story. We talked about statistical power and how sample size can have a big impact on the story we're able to tell. We talked about external validity in terms of who our study applies to and how that impacts our story in terms of how we can make our conclusions, and then ended with internal validity, really thinking through, are there alternate explanations for our results, and trying to limit those, because if we do have those, it undercuts our entire statistical story that we're trying to tell.